focuses on empowering women to run for office. And I've also been involved in different aspects of political involvement, including campaigns, fundraising, and all the works that involve being a political activist. So thank you.
Right. Hey, managers, my name is Marvin Chodry, and I'm a seasoned alumni, actually. I'm the former AS Chair of Elections, and I'm currently a research associate for the LA City Health Commission. And I have political ties because I've worked in various political campaigns throughout the district. And I've also interned for a bunch of representatives and Congress members. So those are my political ties. I'm trying to get an MD and change the healthcare system so that healthcare access is expanded. And hopefully once I get my MD, I can run for office, something like that, but that's me.
Awesome, thank you, Marvin. And then also right before we get started, we do want to just want to make the quick disclaimer that the propositions that we'll be talking about today and the stances and the different positions behind them are not positions that me, Leslie, or Marvin, or AS, or the organizations that we belong to agree with or adopt. We are simply presenting a nonpartisan presentation on what are the different discussions happening around these different propositions so that you can go ahead and make an informed decision when you vote this November 3rd. So without further ado, Marvin, take it away.
So let's just get straight to Prop 14. Prop 14 is about stem cell research. All the information presented is from this voter's guide that was sent out to your addresses. If you don't have a physical copy, you can find one online at votersguidesos.ca.gov, which Sahar will link in a bit. So some of the background about this is that with this proposition, programs that promote stem cell research, medical research, stem cell therapy and delivery, and student and physician training and fellowships will all be expanded. Essentially, the state can now sell $5.5 billion in general obligation bonds to fund these grants that will go toward conducting basic science research, developing potential treatments, undertaking clinical trials, construction of new facilities, and research internships for college students. And the cost to repay these bonds would be $7.8 billion a year, including interest, and repaid over 30 years at an approximate rate of $260 million a year. So what this means, would you mind going to the next slide? So yes basically means that it authorizes the state to sell that $5.5 billion in general obligation bonds and refund these grants for stem cell research, with $1.5 billion of that being allocated for research to treatments for diseases affecting the brain and central nervous system. No, on the other hand, means that the state cannot sell that $5.5 million in general obligation bonds for stem cell research. Next slide. So the argument for this is that stem cells have the potential to regenerate cells, tissue, and organs, and can potentially go to help treat other diseases. And the funds from the grants that the proposition creates goes towards inherently good things: basic science research, development of potential treatments, funding clinical trials, new research facilities, and research internships. Additionally, grant recipients who license or sell their inventions must also give some of that income back to the state to support any state program given this new source of revenue. The amount that the state has to pay after bond sales is $260 million a year, and that's less than 1% of the state's current general fund budget. This will not increase your taxes, and nor will you have to pay anything for this. If Prop 14 passes, you basically don't have to pay anything related to taxes or anything along those lines. In 2004, California already passed a proposition to give stem cell research more funding. However, that money ran out this year. The previous funding that we passed in 2004 actually approves 92 FDA clinical trials. And there was a significant process because of those trials, and it led to treatments and cures. One example, this is a high school student who was paralyzed in a diving accident, and he regained upper body function because he was able to be treated with those stem cells with the funding. Another example is of a woman with a genetic disease who was eventually blinded, but she got her eyesight back because of stem cell research. Treatments and cures will also become more affordable for Californians, and Prop 14 will also help to provide financial assistance for those treatment and cures. New jobs and increased economic activity are also an outcome of this proposition. Next slide. So the argument against it is that it's really difficult to estimate the invention-related income that the state will receive, and the revenue that comes from this is uncertain because research does not usually lead to an invention. As of right now, the state has only collected a total of a few $100,000 since 2004 in invention-related income. Considering the fact that we are currently in an economic crisis, the state giving $5.5 billion to stem cell research may not be the best idea. After passing the original proposition in 2004 that gave stem cell research funding, only a few federally approved therapies have resulted. Many of these grants also went to companies headquartered in other states, so some of these jobs being created aren't even in California. $2.4 million of this money actually went to the part-time vice chairman of the board in giving these grants, who was neither a doctor nor a medical scientist. The National Institute of Health already provides $1.5 billion a year in grants for this same type of research as well. So now with Leslie, you can go on to Prop 15. You're muted, Leslie.
Thank you. And I saw a message from one of our guests for us to speak a little bit more slowly, so I'll try to do my best to do that and also keep in mind of time. So Prop 15 is a property tax reform, and so just some background information on that. So what it would do essentially is amend the Constitution to allow commercial and industrial properties to be taxed at their market value rather than their purchase price. So there's a lot of historical context when it comes to this proposition, mainly focused on Prop 13. Prop 13 was a proposition that was passed by voters in 1978, in the late 1970s, which focused on ensuring that residential and commercial properties would be taxed according to the price that they paid at the time. So if you bought a property in 1970, then you would continue paying that same amount of price, or that same amount in taxes every year, regardless of the size, regardless of the age, and it'll only occur an annual increase of 2% or inflation, whichever is lower. And the only exception to these are properties that are designated towards agricultural purposes. Next slide, please. So what does yes mean? So supporting or voting yes on this proposition would mean that you would support requiring that commercial and industrial properties be taxed based on their market value. And so what would happen if they were voted on in this way is that 60% of the tax revenue that would be collected from this tax increase on these commercial properties and industrial properties would be allocated towards the state, and the other 40% would be allocated towards school districts and community colleges. Again, just for some historical context, school funding is tied to property taxes. And so if you are in an area, or if there is an area that receives less taxes from property taxes, then those schools will be underfunded. And then voting no would mean that it would continue to tax commercial properties based on their purchase price at the time that you bought them. Next slide, please. So the argument for this is that large companies, California companies like Chevron, Disneyland, those big ones that we know here in our state, they reside on very extremely valuable property that is worth a lot of money and that they should be paying a lot more in taxes. And they're also companies that make a lot of money and they don't pay their fair share in taxes. Plus the schools that are in that area are not receiving the funding that they need because, like I mentioned, Prop 13 ties school funding to property taxes. However, the argument against it is that a massive tax increase of this measure will basically prompt companies to flee from California. So because the property taxes are so high for these companies will have less of incentive to establish roots here in our state and essentially contribute to the economy here, especially during a time where businesses are already struggling. And moving on to Prop 16.
There we go. So a bit of background for Prop 16. Currently, Proposition 209, which was passed in 1996, prohibits the government from discriminating against or granting preferential treatment to individuals or groups based on race, sex, color, etc. Proposition 16 will repeal Proposition 209 and will allow diversity as a factor in public employment, education, and contracting decisions. Prior to Prop 209, state and local entities had policies and programs that were intended to increase opportunities and representation for people who faced inequalities as a result of their race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. Next slide, please. So yes means that state and local entities can consider race, sex, color, ethnicity, and national origin in public education, public employment, and public contracting to the extent allowed under federal and state law. No means that the current ban on the consideration of race, color, ethnicity, and national origin in public education, public employment, and public contracting is upheld. Next slide, please. So the argument for this is that saying yes on Prop 16 means an equal opportunity for all Californians, increasing access to fair wages, good jobs, and quality schools for everyone. This proposition fights against wage discrimination and systemic racism, helping to open up multiple opportunities for women and BIPOC. White men are overrepresented in positions of wealth and power in California still, and nearly all public contracts and the jobs that come with them go to large companies run by older white men. White women make 80 cents on the dollar, and the wage disparity is even worse for women of color. In essence, affirmative action will be used as a tool to combat discrimination and level the playing field. Next slide, please. So the argument against it is that it's likely Prop 16 will be used, but will be using government money to benefit politically connected high-bid contractors who are supposedly minority or who hire a so-called minority as window dressing. Prop 16 will not fix past discrimination against racial minorities and women by discriminating against other racial minorities and men who are innocent of any wrongdoing. Schools will begin to keep students of one race out to help students of another race get in, rather than missions remaining merit-based. California has successful men and women of all races and ethnicities. It is harmful to perpetuate the stereotype that minorities and women cannot make it unless they get special preferences. Currently, California schools can give students from low-income families or students who would be the first in their families to attend college a leg up. The state can also currently help small businesses started by low-income individuals or favor low-income individuals for job opportunities. With affirmative action, the University of California will be able to give a wealthy lawyer's son preferential treatment for admission over a farm worker's daughter because he may be from an underrepresented group. Leslie?
Thank you. So now moving on to Proposition 17. So Proposition 17 focuses on parolee voting rights. So for some background information, this would essentially amend the California Constitution to allow those on parole for a felony conviction to allow them to vote in elections. Because as it currently stands, current California law prevents people from voting if they're in prison or if they're on parole for a felony crime. Next slide, please. So what does yes mean? So yes means that it would essentially allow these people who are on parole for a felony conviction to vote. It would essentially restore their voting rights. People who are formerly incarcerated are known to be a disenfranchised group, and so this Prop 17 will be a movement towards restoring their voting rights and having them be successfully reintegrated into society since they have already finished their sentences. A vote for no would mean an opposition to this constitutional amendment. Next slide, please. So what's the argument for it? So the argument is that it should restore voting rights to the disenfranchised group because they've already completed their prison sentences and now they're reintegrating into society. Voting is a very important part of being a civically engaged citizen, and so since these people have already fulfilled their sentences, then they should be given that right back. The argument against it, however, is that people on parole are still being closely monitored and anything could change. Their case could go a different way. They're still in that process where their rights are not fully restored, and so voting should not be reinstated to them because there could be a situation where they could go back or they could violate the parole and whatnot. Many different factors on a case-by-case basis, and so that's basically the argument against this.
So a bit of background for Prop 18. Every even year, California holds both a primary and general election. A person may generally register to vote in a California election if they're a U.S. citizen and will be of 18 years of age by general election day. This proposition will allow 17-year-old citizens to vote in a primary or special election so long as they're 18 by the time general election day happens. This basically allows them to vote in primary elections. Next slide, please. So yes would amend the California Constitution to permit 17-year-olds who will be at least 18 old or otherwise eligible to vote at the time of the next general election to vote in that primary election or special election that occurred before the next general election. No means that it stays as it is right now, and individuals who are at least 18 years old on the date of election can vote in that election only for the general election. Next slide, please. So the argument for this is that first-time voters will now be able to participate in the entire election cycle, and it may boost youth participation in voting. The proposition will help to amplify the voices of many young voters throughout California and will lead to a more inclusive election process for our state. Nearly half the states in the US already allow for 17-year-olds to participate in their primaries and caucuses. Nearly half the states already allow for the US, in the US already allow for 17-year-olds to participate in their primaries and caucuses. The youth are extremely underrepresented in our election process, even though many of the policies created in elections directly affect them. Many studies also show that voting is habit forming. Once an individual votes in that election, they're more likely to vote again and again. So early involvement helps in the electoral process. And some 17-year-olds already work, pay taxes, and can enlist in the military. Next slide, please. So the argument against this is that there will be an increased cost for counties between several hundred of thousands and $1 million for every 2 years in order to send and process more voting materials for eligible voters. There will be an increased one-time cost for the state in order to update an existing voter registration system, and many tax increases and bond debt measures are decided on in primary and special election ballots, something that typical 17-year-olds wouldn't understand. 17-year-olds are also in high school and have strong incentive to do whatever teachers and counselors recommend for them, and thus are likely to only hear one side of the issues. One example of this is during one special election, LAUSD engaged in an informational campaign to pass Measure EE, a proposed tax increase. Schools posted huge banners on campus and handed out flyers and literature to impressionable 17-year-olds.
Okay, so Prop 19, this is a prop on property transfer tax. So the tax ones are always a little bit confusing, so I'll try to break this down as much as possible. So some background information. So this would essentially allow homeowners who are over 55, severely disabled, or whose homes were destroyed by wildfire or any other natural disaster to transfer their primary residence property tax base value to a replacement residence of any value anywhere in the state. So just to break that down a little bit, so if a individual who owns a home who's over 55 meets any of these qualifications, has their home destroyed by wildfire, they're allowed to buy another house or another property anywhere in the state, and whatever tax rate or tax base value, as they say here, they had on their original home, they can transfer over to their new home. So if they bought a home that was less expensive, they could move it over to a more expensive home anywhere in the States. And it would essentially limit tax benefits for certain transfers of real property between family members. So again, this just refers to homes. And it will allocate the resulting state revenues and savings, if any, to fire protection services and reimburse local governments for taxation related charges. Next slide, please. Okay, so the really key, or the key difference here is between all and some. So yes means that all homeowners who are over 55 and who meet these other qualifications that I mentioned before would be eligible for property tax savings when they move. Only inherited properties used as primary homes or farms would be eligible for property tax savings. So any other additional homes that that homeowner is not living in, let's say they're renting it, those would not be eligible for these property tax savings. No means that only some homeowners who are over 55 would continue to be eligible for property tax savings when they move. All inherited properties would continue to be eligible for property tax savings. So there's a difference between these two. Essentially, it's a difference between who benefits and who essentially continues to benefit according to what the status quo is. Next slide, please. Okay, okay. Oh, no, it was the argument for. Yeah, go back one. Okay, thank you. So the argument for is that these property tax rules give people who've owned their homes in California for many years little incentive to move. So the current property tax rules, and essentially the argument is based that empty nesters or people who no longer have children, usually an elderly couple who are living in an elderly couple who's living in a house that's typically made for a full-size family, they're not willing to downsize because they have a fear of paying higher taxes on a new house. So this would essentially close that loophole that allows wealthy people to pass on homes to their children who use them as rental properties, and give these empty nesters more of an incentive to move into smaller properties. However, the argument against this is that this proposition is essentially backed by large real estate interests. So there's really a question of who is backing this and why are they doing this, and if they're doing this for a monetary incentive. And while it does eliminate one of the loopholes, it would essentially create a bigger problem by allowing wealthy homeowners to continue reaping the benefits of Prop 13, which, like I mentioned earlier, allows homeowners to continue paying the same tax rate that they've been paying for the property at the time that they purchased the property. Plus there's also discussion on whether revenue should be automatically earmarked for fire suppression, and whether or not there should be a larger conversation on whether those taxes should be used for something else.
So Prop 20 is kind of a big one. Prop 20 has 4 major changes. It changes state law to increase criminal penalties for some theft-related crimes. It changes how people released from state prison are supervised in the community, and it makes various changes to the processes created by Prop 57 for considering the release of inmates from prison. And it requires state laws and local law enforcement to collect DNA from adults convicted of certain crimes. So let's break those down one by one. There will be 2 new theft-related crimes that are introduced: serial theft and organized retail theft. In addition, it also allows some existing theft-related crimes that are misdemeanors, a less severe crime, to be punished as felonies, the most severe crime. Currently, theft of all property worth less than $950 from a store is generally punished as a misdemeanor, but Prop 20 would make that a felony. Currently, paroled officers have the option to ask a judge to change the terms of a parolee's probation or supervision, but under Prop 20, the third time that a parolee breaks that terms of parole, the parole officer is now required to ask that judge to change the terms of their probation. Next, Prop 20 will make it more difficult for the Board of Parole Hearings to release inmates and force the Board of Parole Hearings to consider more information when considering an inmate's release, such as the inmate's attitude about their crimes. Finally, Prop 20 makes so that DNA samples would be collected from adults convicted of misdemeanors, such as shoplifting, forging checks, and certain domestic violence crimes. This proposition would increase state and local correctional costs, but is estimated to cost less than 1% of the state's current general fund budget. Next slide, please. So essentially, yes means that we're going to increase the way that that law enforcement works in the sense of trying to catch criminals and processing their DNA. So people who commit certain theft-related crimes could receive increased penalties, and additional factors also be considered for the state's process and releasing of certain inmates from prison. Law enforcement is required to collect DNA samples from adults convicted of certain misdemeanors. No basically means that nothing changes, it stays the same as it is. Next slide, please. So the argument for this is that under California law, assault with deadly weapon is considered as a nonviolent offense along with date rape and sex trafficking. Proposition 20 fixes this because it closes the loophole in the law that now allows convicted child molesters, sexual predators, and other convicted criminals to be released from prison early. Proposition 20 also expands DNA collection to help solve rapes, murders, and other serious crimes, and straightens sanctions against habitual thieves who steal repeatedly. And this also protects victims and gives offenders longer access to counseling, anger management, and other rehabilitation programs. Next slide, please. So the argument against this is that California already has lengthy sentences and strict punishments for serious and violent crimes. This proposition could cost the state tens of millions of dollars on the prison industrial complex. California is already facing cuts to schools, healthcare, and mental health services, so spending more money on prisons will be wasteful. Proposition 20 also means that thefts of items worth more than $250 would be charged as a felony, which is extreme and out of line in comparison to other states. This also means that more teenagers and Black, Latino, and low-income people could be locked up for years for low-level nonviolent crimes.
Alrighty, so Prop 21. So Prop 21 focuses on rent control. This proposition would allow local jurisdictions, so local governments, to put rent control in place for all kinds of housing, including single-family homes, condos, and townhomes. There are two exceptions to this, however, which is if the home or building is newer, first occupied in the last 15 years, so if it was built 15 years ago, and if the landlord only owns up to 2 properties. So these two kinds of properties will be exempted from this. And this proposition would replace the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act of 1995. And then for some context of what that is that Costa-Hawkins was a bill or a law that was passed that allowed landlords to raise rent after a tenant moves out. So if a tenant leaves an apartment space, then the landlord of that apartment can raise the rent price. So if someone paid $1,000 a month, they can raise it to $1,500, and so on and so forth. There's essentially no limits to that. But Prop 21 will put a limit to how much they can raise the rent of a vacated unit to 15% over 3 years. So again, in that example, if a tenant leaves an apartment space and the landlord had originally charged $1,000 a month, they can no longer, so they can no longer charge more than 15% more than what they already did in the 3-year period. And this would allow local governments to adopt rent control on housing units. Next slide, please. Okay. What does yes mean? Okay, sorry. So yes means is that it would essentially allow local governments to enact rent control on housing that was first occupied over 15 years ago. So again, that just means that if there's a living space that was first occupied 15 years ago, built 15 years ago, rent control can be enacted on it. A vote for no means that no changes are made, rent control is limited. So the scope at which local governments can enact rent control is limited because there's no state law or state proposition or law that will say this is the amount, which here is 15%. Next slide, please. Okay. So the argument for is that renters need more protections in California's expensive housing market. This is probably something that we're all very familiar with. Rent is on the rise, and it's something that is very difficult for many of us who are renters. And so this proposition would allow local governments the ability to expand more of these protections to ensure that landlords are not overpricing their units. However, the argument against it is that more rent control would worsen the housing crisis by reducing private builders' profit incentive to build more housing. So if housing or private builders know that they cannot get a certain amount of return that they want for the units that they're renting out, then essentially the argument is that they would be less incentivized to build here.
Prop 22. So currently, rideshare and delivery apps classify their drivers as independent contractors instead of employees, because companies currently do not set drivers' hours, require acceptance of specific rides or delivery requests, and do not restrict working for other companies. However, independent contractors are not covered by state employment laws, which means they don't get minimum wage necessarily, and they don't get unemployment insurance, and they don't get workers' comp. Instead, independent contractors are entitled to minimum earnings, healthcare subsidies, and vehicle insurance. Currently, California recently passed a law that limits the ability of companies to hire workers as independent contractors. The rideshare and delivery apps do not agree with this, so they wanted to pass Prop 22, so it would make it so that people working for rideshare and delivery apps can remain as independent contractors. Proposition 22 will also require companies to give these independent contractors certain benefits, such as 120% of minimum wage while driving, help with payment for health insurance for drivers who work 15 hours a week, and payment for medical costs and replacement of some lost income when a driver is injured while driving or waiting for a customer. Additionally, these companies must also prohibit drivers from working more than 12 hours in a 24-hour period for one ride rideshare or delivery app and must create sexual harassment policies, conduct criminal background checks, and mandate safety training for drivers. Next slide, please. Seems to be frozen. So one slide before that. There we go. So yes basically means that app-based rideshare and delivery companies can hire these drivers as independent contractors. And this means that drivers can decide when, where, and how to work, but would not get standard benefits that comes with being employees. No means that app-based rideshare and delivery companies can have to hire these drivers as employees if the courts say that a recent state law makes drivers employees. Drivers would have less choice about where, when, and where to go and how much they want to work, but would get the standard benefits and protections that come with being employees. Next slide, please. So the argument for this is that in a 4-to-1 margin, independent surveys actually say that app-based drivers overwhelmingly support Prop 22 and want to work as independent contractors and not as employees. These drivers tend to have other jobs, family obligations, or health issues and need flexibility to continue this work and need this supplemental income to support their families. This proposition will also provide new benefits for these independent contractors actually. More than 80% of the drivers work less than 20 hours a week and can't work set shifts as employees because of other obligations. Prop 22 may potentially eliminate hundreds of thousands of jobs. Next slide, please. So the argument against this is that voting no stops billion-dollar app companies like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash from writing their own exemption to California law and profiting from it. Prop 22 denies their drivers rights and safety protections that they deserve: sick leave, healthcare, and unemployment benefits. The California Attorney General actually recently sued these delivery and rideshare companies for breaking the law and for avoiding responsibility for their drivers for years. This proposition is another way for them to get out of that responsibility. Many of the app drivers are Latino, Black, and other communities of color that need benefits like sick leave, healthcare, unemployment benefits, and flexibility in their scheduling. Current law does not actually limit these rideshare and delivery companies from granting those employees flexibility in scheduling, although Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash portray it in this way in order to confuse voters. A recent University of California study found that a majority of drivers are not part-time and actually work 30 hours or more per week.
Alrighty, so Prop 23 focuses on dialysis clinic changes. So the prop itself would require dialysis clinics to have at least one physician present while patients are being treated, except when there's a shortage of medical staff. And also these dialysis clinics will be required to report patient infection data to the state, which they currently do not do, and to get consent from the state before closing. This measure would also ban clinics from discriminating on the basis of who is paying for a patient's care. So what this means is that if a patient is coming in and they need treatment, however, their treatment is not paid for private insurance, or instead it's being paid for a government program such as Medi-Cal or Medicare, these clinics cannot deny access to them or access to those services. Next slide, please. So a vote for yes would mean that all of these clinics in the state would be required to meet these new changes, which again are having a physician present at all times, report data to the Department of Public Health of the state, and obtain a state approval before closing a clinic. And again, not to discriminate against patients based on their source of payment. A vote for no would mean that no extra requirements will be imposed on the clinics in the state. Moving on. So the argument for this is that these increased regulations would make clinics safer for patients. They can have a doctor on staff in case anything goes wrong. Also, the requirement to report data to the state keeps these clinics accountable for their infection rate and making sure that patients are getting safe and adequate care. And then also ensuring that patients with any insurance, whether it's private, whether it's government funded, are getting equal treatment and they're not being discriminated on that, because dialysis is a life-saving treatment. And then the argument against it is that according to dialysis clinics, or the people who run these clinics, is that these increased regulations would impose costs on these clinics and would make resources less available to patients.
So Prop 24 permits consumers to prevent businesses from sharing personal information, correct inaccurate personal information, and limit businesses' use of sensitive personal information, including precise geolocation, race, ethnicity, and health information. It will establish the California Privacy Protection Agency, and it also changes the criteria for which businesses must comply with the laws and triples maximum penalties for violations concerning consumers under age 16. This proposition would provide new consumer privacy rights, such as limiting the sharing of personal data by permitting consumers to direct businesses not to share their personal data, allowing consumers to direct businesses to correct personal data, and letting consumers direct businesses to limit the use of their sensitive personal data. In order to establish this new government agency, it would cost the state an approximate $10 million annually. Next slide, please. So yes would mean that existing consumer data privacy laws and rights would be expanded. Businesses required to meet privacy requirements would change. A new state agency would be developed, and the Department of Justice would share responsibility for overseeing and enforcing state consumer privacy laws. No would mean that businesses would continue to be required to follow existing consumer data privacy laws. Consumers would have to continue to have existing data privacy rights, and the state's Department of Justice would continue to oversee and enforce those laws alone. Next slide, please. So the argument for this is that the world's biggest corporations are collecting personal data constantly, and private information about us and all of our current laws are not strong enough to regulate this. Consumers need stronger protection, and this proposition will not provide it to them. Corporations continue, this proposition will provide it to them. Corporations continue to make billions buying and selling our personal information, apps, phones, and cars, and sell your personal information constantly, but Prop 24 will give consumers the ability to forbid businesses to stop tracking you without your personal knowledge or permission. These corporations also do not keep your information safe. In 2018, there were 1.2 billion data breaches within the US, with over 45 million records exposed, which led to massive identity theft. Next slide, please. So the argument against this is that Prop 24 asks you to pay for, or asks you to approve an internet pay for privacy scheme, and was written behind closed doors by giant tech corporations who refuse to take input from consumer privacy and rights groups. Those who do not pay could end up getting inferior service, such as bad connections, slower downloads, and more pop-up ads. Prop 24 allows employers to secretly gather information for more years to come and overrides a new law that actually lets workers know what sensitive private information their bosses have on them. You can already set up apps and web browsers to stop selling your personal data, but Prop 24 would disregard those instructions and shift the burden onto you to notify each and every single website and app to individually protect your data.
And last but not least, we have Proposition 25. So Prop 25 focuses on eliminating cash bail. So again, for some context, Senate Bill 10, which was passed in 2018 by the California legislature, eliminated the cash bail system in California and instead replaced it with an algorithmic risk assessment method that determines who gets released from jail while awaiting trial based on the risk to society instead of ability to pose bond. This prop is essentially a referendum on that law, and that is a process in California that allows people to essentially veto or uphold a law by putting it on the ballot. Moving on. So what does the yes vote mean? So yes means that we are upholding the Senate Bill 10. So what that means in essence is that cash bail would be replaced with risk assessments on a case-by-case basis. So what that means is that so rather than a set amount of money that you have to pay in order to post bail. Instead, there'll be an algorithm or some kind of a risk assessment test to assert whether or not you could be let go pending trial. And then a no vote means is that the voters would be essentially rejecting Senate Bill 10, and the bail system would remain as it is. So people would continue to have to pay that number that is imposed on them by the judge. Next slide, please. And then the argument for this is that SB 10, or this proposition, which is in spirit of SB 10, creates a system that is fair to everyone who's accused of a crime, and the bail bonds businesses are only putting this issue on the ballot to try to continue profiting off the cash bail system. The argument against this is that this new risk assessment is also flawed as well, because it still leaves room for racial bias, so it's not essentially a good replacement for California's longstanding cash bail system. So what the argument against it is trying to say is that although they do see the merits of rejecting a cash bail system, there are still ways for discrimination to still arise through this algorithmic risk assessment method. And that is done for the propositions. I think we're really good on time.
Wow, well, I just want to very quickly thank you both once again for that amazing presentation. I know I myself learned so much about the proposition. And now I'm going to ask a few questions that were submitted by our audience members. So I'm just going to go ahead and read out, and for the audience, if you have any questions you want to submit, now's the time. Please use the Q&A feature, and I will go ahead and read them out loud, and Marvin and Leslie will do their best to answer them. So the first question we have is, how would Prop 20 apply to looting as implied in organized crime and recent civil unrest?
So in terms of looting, it would be the change in the amount that is looted. So let's say that something, the way we have it currently is that if you loot less than $950 worth of stuff, it's currently counted as a misdemeanor. But Prop 20 would change it so that if you loot $250 worth of stuff rather than the $950, it's now counted as a felony. So they can charge it as a felony. And for the civil unrest, it would, I mean, I guess in terms of protests, if people are arrested in that sort of way, they would have their DNA collected because they're arrested now.
Great, that was very enlightening. Thank you so much. I actually don't see any more questions as of this time. I'm gonna wait maybe one more minute and see if anyone has any last minute questions they want to submit. Thank you both again. This was very informative.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Sahara.
Oh, I think we got one more. So concerning Prop 23, why are there commercials of dialysis patients saying that clinics will close if we vote for or against?
Okay, I can answer that. So let me pull up notes real quick. Okay, so that was Prop 23. Okay, so like I said, for Prop 23, so the argument going against it is that according to dialysis clinics, who are essentially putting out these advertisements, they're saying that these imposed new regulations, which like I mentioned, were a physician on site, not discriminating against on patients based on their method of pay, and then also reporting the numbers to the state regarding infections. They are essentially arguing that these imposed regulations would cost them money. So if you think of this in like a business model, right? Anytime that, in theory, right? Anytime that a regulation is imposed on a business, a cost is incurred for that business. And so these dialysis companies are arguing, hey, if you impose these regulations on us, we're gonna have to cut corners somewhere. And so we think that we might have to close some dialysis clinics because of these imposed regulations. It's this business model mindset that by imposing these regulations, numbers or money needs to be cut from somewhere, and so they're arguing that as a result they will have to close some facilities. So that's where that argument comes from in those commercials.
Thank you so much, and we actually have a few more questions now. So for Prop 15, would school districts and colleges benefit from it if it were to pass, or would it harm them?
Okay, I can answer that one too. Okay, so like I mentioned when I was going over this, a vote for yes would mean that these commercial properties would essentially be paying more in property tax. So like I had mentioned with a little bit more context is that basically the way how state funds or the way how taxes are allocated to schools is based on property tax in the area where that school is in. So for example, if you have let's say a community college that is near an area where homes are not as valuable, quote unquote, due to their property tax, then that community college will receive less funding. However, if you increase the property tax and the amount that these houses or these homeowners or these commercial buildings, which is what this building or what this proposition is talking about, those business owners will have to pay more in taxes. So we're talking about companies like Disneyland, right? Think of that whole Disneyland area, right? That's a big commercial property, and they're currently paying the same taxes that they paid when Disneyland was opened or whenever. Please don't quote me, I don't know exactly what year. But the idea is that whatever schools are in those areas, because Disney would get taxed more if this proposition were to pass, then that money we siphoned off into community colleges. So I guess the answer is yes, it would benefit them because then they would have more funding, because in this state, school funding is tied to property tax.
Great, thank you so much. That was very helpful. We have two more questions, the first of which being, which groups lobbied for Proposition 23? Was it the patients or the clinics?
So lobbied in support of this bill, which again would be in support of imposing these regulations. To my knowledge and based on my research for this presentation, the groups that lobbied for this were patient groups or patient-oriented, patient advocate groups. The groups who lobbied against this were clinics. So like someone who mentioned earlier regarding the commercials, that's kind of like the argument that came out of there, based on my knowledge and research on this.
Great, and our very last question is, how do you search for different opinions and facts, or what resources did you both use to come up with all this information?
So we're going to also go over this tomorrow when we cover the seat races and candidates for that. So that'll be really helpful in finding different opinions and, you know, different data on what people stand for. But for this one, what I did was I actually used a voter's guide, and it has a whole list of different opinions and facts written by the state of California. So I think Sahara linked it in the description as well, but you can find it at votersguide.sos.ca.gov/propositions, and it has basically everything that's in this little pamphlet.
Yeah, and just to echo what Marvin was saying, that pamphlet is a really good resource for nonpartisan information, but there's also plenty of websites that I personally use to get this information. So one of them is currently in the chat box, which is called Voters Edge, and right there addressing back to the question of who supported and who opposed this, who lobbied for it. This website, votersedge.org, is a really good resource to seeing who is essentially funding, who is backing, who is supporting, who is against this, and that way you can make that analysis yourself. Also, if you just type online California propositions, you can find many websites going over this. Of course, you have to do your own due diligence in finding sources that you know, are credible and that, you know, don't lean towards a bias. Unless you're looking for that, then, you know, you make your own judgment call.
Thank you so much. We actually just got one last question. I'm going to go ahead and ask it. Are Prop 15 and Prop 19 directly related in terms of home ownership and taxes?
Okay, so let me look over those again because I don't want to make a mistake. Give me one moment. Okay, so Prop 15 focuses on commercial and industrial properties. So that's the key difference. So Prop 15 focuses on commercial and industrial properties. So like the example that I gave, Chevron, Disneyland, these big properties that are not used for homes. Prop 19, however, let me double check. Prop 19 has to do with homes. Yeah, so this focuses on homes, you know, residential properties, mom and dad's house, those types of homes. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And I think that just about wraps up all our questions in our presentation today. I want to thank you both again so much for your time and your effort put into researching all these. You did a fabulous job and you taught us all so much. And I want to remind everyone that's here that we highly encourage you to join us again tomorrow at 5 o'clock, as we'll be covering the seat races as well. So tomorrow at 5 o'clock, we will continue our part 2, and thank you all so much for attending.